Don't touch that table unless you actually understand what's on it, Jonathan Blake said without even looking at her, his voice smooth, controlled, and sharp enough to slice through the soft jazz humming across the private dining room as the clink of crystal glasses slowed and every conversation quietly folded into silence. Ava Carter paused with the tray in her hands, the weight of polished silverware and imported wine steady against her palm, her posture straight, her expression calm, as if the words had landed somewhere far away, somewhere unimportant, because in a room built on power, the most dangerous thing you could be was unmoved. The restaurant sat 40 floors above downtown Manhattan, wrapped in glass and gold, the kind of place where deals weren't just signed, they were staged, where a single dinner could move $800 million across continents before dessert was even served, and tonight, every seat at that curved walnut table was filled with people who believed they controlled outcomes. Jonathan Blake sat at the head like he owned gravity itself, tailored navy suit, silver watch catching the low amber light, his presence precise, calculated, the kind of man who didn't raise his voice because he never needed to. People leaned in when he spoke. They adjusted themselves around his expectations. They learned quickly that approval from him wasn't given. It was earned, and rarely. Across from him, executives nodded along as projections flickered. Across tablets, numbers whispered like promises, growth curves, acquisition leverage, international expansion, all of it balanced on the edge of one final agreement, one clause, one signature, and yet in the middle of that carefully constructed world stood Ava, invisible by design, just another waitress in a pressed black uniform, moving between power without being part of it, or at least that's what they believed. She poured water with steady hands, refilled glasses before they were empty, adjusted plates before anyone noticed they needed adjusting, her presence quiet but precise, like someone who wasn't just serving the room but studying it, every word, every hesitation, every glance exchanged when numbers didn't quite align. And when Jonathan finally looked at her, really looked this time, it wasn't to see her, it was to correct her, to remind her of her place, because in his world, people were roles, and roles didn't shift. You're slowing us down, he added, almost casually, as if her existence itself was a disruption, a minor inconvenience in a night built for control, and a few guests chuckled softly. Not because it was funny, but because it was safe, because laughter, even uncomfortable laughter, was currency in rooms like this. Ava gave a small nod. Nothing more, stepping back just enough to disappear again. But not before her eyes flicked, just once, toward the contract resting beside Jonathan's hand. A single page slightly out of alignment, a number buried in dense legal language, the kind of detail no one notices until it's too late. And for a brief second, so brief it could have been missed entirely, her gaze lingered, not with doubt, not with confusion, but with recognition. The room exhaled. Conversation resumed. Confidence rebuilt itself in the space her silence left behind, and Jonathan leaned back in his chair, satisfied, believing the moment had passed, believing control had been reaffirmed, because men like him always believed that, until the exact second they realized they were wrong. Jonathan lifted his glass again as if nothing had happened, as if the rhythm of the room had fully returned to his control, but something subtle had shifted, something quiet and almost invisible, the kind of shift that does not announce itself, yet changes everything. Across the table, his chief financial officer leaned in, tapping the edge of the contract with a pen, speaking in low measured tones about projections and risk buffers. But his voice carried a faint hesitation now, a fraction of a second longer between words, the kind only noticed by those who were truly paying attention, and Ava noticed. She moved along the perimeter of the room, refilling a glass here, adjusting a plate there, her steps light, her presence nearly erased again, yet her mind remained fixed on that single line she had seen, that one detail buried in polished language, because numbers, unlike people, did not lie. They only waited to be understood. Jonathan began outlining the final terms, his voice confident, controlled, the cadence of a man who had closed deals in rooms far more hostile than this one. Once we finalize the valuation structure, we can move forward with immediate integration, he said, glancing briefly at the investors who nodded in agreement, their confidence tied not to certainty, but to his certainty, Because in rooms like this, belief often followed authority. Ava paused near the edge of the table again, not interrupting, not intruding, just present enough to hear the numbers spoken out loud. And when Jonathan referenced the projected revenue alignment, her eyes flicked once more to the document, confirming what she already knew. The duplication was not theoretical, it was real, it was measurable, and it was dangerous. She could feel the weight of that knowledge, not as pressure, but as clarity, the kind that does not demand attention but waits for the right moment to be seen. A soft laugh broke from one of the guests as Jonathan made a passing remark about precision, about how every detail had been accounted for. And that was when Ava spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for the words to land exactly where they needed to. "Excuse me, sir, but the projected revenue in Section 14.2 appears to be counted twice under both domestic and international streams." And just like that, the room stopped again, not with noise, but with absence, the absence of movement, the absence of certainty, the absence of control. The chief financial officer's pen froze mid-tap, his eyes dropping to the page, scanning quickly, then again more slowly, and then once more with something closer to concern, while Jonathan remained still, his expression unchanged, but his silence now carried weight, not authority, but calculation. No one laughed this time. No one shifted in their seat, because something had entered the room that money could not smooth over, something precise, undeniable, and quietly disruptive. And for the first time that night, the center of the room was no longer where Jonathan sat. It was where Ava stood, calm, composed, and completely unshaken. For a moment, no one spoke, not because they did not know what to say, but because they were all doing the same thing at once, recalculating, rereading, rethinking the certainty they had just seconds ago believed was unshakable. And at the center of it, Ava did not move, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression steady, as if she had not just shifted the weight of an $800 million decision with a single sentence. The chief financial officer leaned forward now, no longer composed, flipping the page back, then forward again, his finger tracing the exact line Ava had pointed out, his lips parting slightly as the realization settled in. Not dramatic, not explosive, just undeniable, the kind of truth that does not need volume to be heard. "Wait," he said quietly, almost to himself, then louder. "She is right. This projection is being carried twice." And that was the moment the room truly changed, not when Ava spoke, but when someone with authority confirmed it. Because in rooms like this, truth alone is not enough. It has to be validated by power. Jonathan's jaw tightened, barely, a subtle shift that would have gone unnoticed by anyone who did not understand him. But Ava saw it, because she had been watching him long before he ever noticed her, watching how he responded when things did not go according to plan, how he recalibrated, how he maintained control, and now, for the first time, that control had a fracture. He leaned forward slowly, placing his hand over the contract, not to hide it, but to claim it, to reassert ownership over the situation, his voice measured as he spoke. "It is a minor oversight, easily corrected." But the words did not land the way they had earlier in the night. They did not carry the same weight, because confidence, once questioned, never fully returns to its original form. One of the investors shifted in his seat, exchanging a glance with another, a silent conversation passing between them, not about numbers, but about risk, about trust, about whether the man leading this deal had seen everything he should have seen. Ava stepped back then, not retreating, just removing herself from the center she had never intended to occupy, her role never to dominate the room, only to reveal what was already there. And as she turned slightly, reaching for an empty glass at the edge of the table, Jonathan's voice stopped her, not loud, not aggressive, but different now, sharper in a new way. "How did you catch that?" he asked, and this time, he was looking directly at her, not through her, not past her, but at her, as if trying to reconcile the image he had created with the reality standing in front of him. Ava met his gaze calmly, no hesitation, no need to impress, just clarity. "Because it did not match the growth rate you mentioned earlier," she said, her tone even, almost gentle, as if she were explaining something simple, something obvious, and the simplicity of it made it worse, because it meant the mistake had not been hidden, It had been overlooked. The silence that followed was no longer awkward. It was heavy, reflective, the kind that forces people to sit with what they have just witnessed. And somewhere near the entrance of the room, unnoticed by most, the doors opened quietly, a presence entering not with noise, but with gravity, and though no one had turned yet, something in the air shifted again, deeper this time, as if the night was not finished revealing what it had been holding back. The doors did not slam, they did not creak, they simply opened, and yet the shift in the room was immediate, subtle but undeniable, like the pressure dropped before a storm, and one by one, heads began to turn, not because they were told to, but because presence like that does not ask for attention, it pulls it. A man stepped inside, mid-60s, silver hair, posture straight without effort, dressed not to impress but to confirm, the kind of authority that did not rely on volume or display. And, though no one had announced him, recognition moved through the room faster than words ever could. Jonathan noticed it too. The way the investors adjusted, the way his own team straightened slightly, the way the center of gravity shifted without permission, and for the first time that evening, he did not speak immediately, because even he understood that moments like this required observation before action. Ava, standing just a few feet from the table, did not turn right away, not out of defiance, but because she already knew who had walked in, the timing, the silence, the way the room responded before seeing. It was familiar, almost predictable, and when she finally did glance toward the entrance, her expression did not change, not surprise, not relief, just recognition, quiet and grounded. The man stepped further into the room, his gaze moving once across the table, taking in the documents, the tension, the unspoken recalculations, and then, without hesitation, it landed on Ava, not scanning, not searching, but finding, as if she had been the reason he entered in the first place. "I believe we are discussing projections," he said calmly, his voice even, measured, carrying across the room without force, and though it was not directed at anyone specifically, everyone felt addressed, because authority, real authority, does not need to name its audience. The chief financial officer shifted in his chair, clearing his throat slightly. "There appears to be a discrepancy," he admitted, choosing his words carefully now, because the dynamic had changed, the confidence that once filled the room now replaced by precision, by caution, by awareness that the margin for error had just narrowed. Jonathan leaned back slightly, his posture controlled, his expression composed, but his eyes sharper. Now, calculating faster, because he was no longer the only one being watched. "We have identified it," he said, reclaiming his tone, though not entirely its weight. "It is being corrected." And for a moment, it almost worked, almost restored the rhythm he had built, until the man near the entrance took another step forward and spoke again, this time with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. "It should not have been there to begin with," he said, and the words did not challenge Jonathan directly. But they did something more powerful. They reframed the moment entirely. Silence followed, deeper than before, not uncertain, but revealing, because now the room was no longer asking whether there was a mistake. It was asking how it had been missed, and more importantly, who had seen it first. The man's gaze returned to Ava, steady, acknowledging, not praising, not elevating, just recognizing. And in that recognition, something shifted again, not in volume, not in movement, but in truth, because the question was no longer about numbers. It was about perception, about who in that room had actually been paying attention. And for the first time that night, the answer was not the man at the head of the table. No one asked his name, because they already knew it, the kind of recognition that does not come from introductions but from headlines, from boardrooms, from decisions that move markets before most people even understand what has happened. And as he stepped closer to the table, the air itself seemed to adjust, not out of fear, but out of awareness. Jonathan remained seated, but his posture shifted just slightly, shoulders squared, chin lifted a fraction higher, not in defiance, but in defense. The subtle body language of a man recalibrating in real time, because power does not disappear, it adapts. The man's gaze moved from the contract to Ava once more, then back to the numbers, and for a brief moment, he said nothing, letting the silence do what it does best, reveal who is comfortable and who is not. One of the investors cleared his throat. Another adjusted his watch, small movements, but telling ones, because confidence had been replaced by caution, and caution spreads quickly in rooms built on certainty. Who identified the discrepancy? The man finally asked, his tone calm, almost conversational, but precise enough that no one mistook it for a casual question, and for a second, no one answered, not because they did not know, but because they were deciding how to answer, who should answer, and what that answer would mean. The chief financial officer glanced at Jonathan, a silent request for direction, but Jonathan did not respond immediately, his eyes fixed on the contract as if the answer might still be rewritten there, as if control could be regained through focus alone. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, measured, but missing something it had carried earlier. It was brought to our attention moments ago, he said, carefully choosing neutrality over acknowledgement. The man nodded once, slowly, then looked directly at Ava, not questioning, not doubting, just confirming. And in that look, the room understood before any words were spoken. The origin of the truth had already been identified. Ava did not step forward, did not claim anything. She simply stood where she was, composed, grounded, as if recognition was not something she needed to reach for, because it had already reached her. Accuracy matters, the man said quietly, more to the room than to any one person, especially when the cost of being wrong is measured in hundreds of millions. And the statement did not accuse, it clarified, drawing a line between confidence and precision, between assumption and understanding. Jonathan exhaled slowly, not visibly, but enough to shift the rhythm of his breathing, and for the first time, his eyes returned to Ava with something new behind them. Not dismissal, not irritation, but assessment, as if he were seeing her for the first time without the filter he had applied earlier, and what he saw did not fit the role he had assigned. You, he said, not sharply, but directly. What is your name? And the question carried weight now, not because of who asked it, but because of when it was asked, after the room had already begun to change. Ava met his gaze again, steady as before, her voice calm, unhurried. Ava Carter, she said, and the name settled into the space between them, simple, unadorned, yet somehow heavier than expected, as if it carried more than just identity, as if it carried history. And near the head of the room, the man who had entered last allowed the smallest shift in expression, not quite a smile, not quite approval, but something closer to recognition, the kind that does not need to be explained to be understood. The name did not echo, it settled, quiet but deliberate. And in that stillness, something shifted again, deeper this time, because names carry weight when the right ears are listening, and the man standing near the head of the room heard it clearly. His gaze did not leave Ava, not out of curiosity, but recognition, the kind that forms long before a moment like this. And when he finally spoke, it was not to question, it was to confirm. Carter, he repeated softly, as if aligning memory with reality. And then, after a brief pause that seemed to stretch longer than it should have, he added, Ava Carter, this time with certainty. A subtle ripple moved through the room, not loud, not dramatic, but present, because something in his tone suggested that this was not new information to him, only newly revealed to everyone else. Jonathan caught it immediately, the shift in tone, the familiarity hidden beneath control, and his eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in recalculation. Because the variables in the room were changing faster than expected, the man took another step forward, now fully within the circle of the table, his presence no longer at the edge, but at the center, and without raising his voice, without asking permission, he spoke again. You noticed the duplication because you have seen this model before. It was not a question, and Ava did not rush to answer, not because she did not have one, but because she understood timing, the value of letting truth unfold rather than forcing it. Yes, she said simply, her voice even, her posture unchanged, and that single word carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it confirmed not just awareness, but familiarity. One of the investors leaned forward now, unable to contain his curiosity. You have worked with this structure before, he asked, his tone cautious, as if stepping into unfamiliar territory, and Ava turned her gaze briefly toward him, acknowledging the question without yielding to it. I have studied it, she replied, choosing precision over expansion, because in a room like this, every extra word becomes a liability. Jonathan's fingers tapped lightly against the table, a habit he rarely allowed to surface. But tonight was no longer following his script, and the presence of this man, this unexpected alignment, was forcing him to reconsider more than just the deal. Where? Jonathan asked, his voice controlled but firmer now, not aggressive, but insistent, because control, once challenged, seeks clarity, and clarity often begins with origin. Ava met his gaze again, steady as before, but before she could answer, the man beside the table spoke, his tone calm, definitive, leaving no room for interruption. She did not study it, he said, and the correction landed with quiet precision. She grew up around it. And this time, the silence that followed was different. It was not about numbers, not about contracts. It was about identity, about context, about the realization that the person they had overlooked was never outside the room. She had simply been seen incorrectly. The chief financial officer leaned back slowly, the pen still in his hand now forgotten, and across the table. One of the investors exhaled quietly, the kind of breath that comes when a narrative changes direction without warning. Jonathan did not speak immediately, because now the question was no longer what had been missed, it was who had been misjudged, and for the first time that night, the answer was standing directly in front of him, calm, composed, and entirely unaffected by the shift she had just created. The words did not land like a revelation. They settled like a truth that had always been there, waiting for the room to catch up, and for a second, no one moved, because understanding something and accepting it are not the same thing, especially in a room where perception had just been proven wrong. Jonathan's gaze stayed on Ava, but now there was no dismissal left in it, no trace of the assumption he had carried earlier, only a sharp, focused reassessment, the kind a strategist makes when the board suddenly changes and the pieces are not where he thought they were. Grew up around it. One of the investors repeated quietly, almost to himself, as if testing the phrase, measuring its implication, and the weight of it began to spread, not through volume, but through realization, because growing up around something meant proximity, exposure, understanding that did not come from textbooks, but from experience, from being inside rooms like this long before tonight. The man standing beside the table did not rush to elaborate. He did not need to, because his presence had already filled in the gaps, and when he finally spoke again, it was not to explain Ava, but to reposition her. Some people learn numbers, he said calmly, his eyes still steady. Others learn what those numbers actually mean. And the distinction settled into the room with quiet precision, drawing a line no one could ignore. Ava remained where she was, not stepping forward, not retreating, her posture unchanged, because nothing about her needed to adjust to fit this moment. She had already been aligned with it before anyone else realized. Jonathan leaned forward slightly now, his hand still resting near the contract, but no longer claiming it, more as if anchoring himself, his voice lower, more deliberate. You should have spoken earlier, he said, not accusing, not dismissing, but acknowledging something he could no longer deny. And Ava met his gaze without hesitation, her answer simple, direct, and quietly decisive. You were not listening earlier, and the sentence did not rise, did not sharpen. It remained calm, which made it land even harder, because truth does not need volume when it is undeniable. A faint shift moved through the table, not discomfort, but recognition, the kind that forces reflection, and for a moment, no one tried to fill the silence, because they understood that this was not a gap, it was a consequence. The chief financial officer exhaled slowly, finally setting his pen down, as if accepting that control had already changed hands, not officially, not structurally, but perceptually, and in rooms like this, perception is often the first thing that moves. Jonathan straightened slightly, his expression composed again, but no longer untouched, because something had been revealed tonight that could not be reversed. Not the mistake, not the correction, but the misjudgment, the assumption that had shaped his actions from the beginning, and now stood exposed in front of everyone. The man beside the table turned his attention back to the contract, but only briefly, because the numbers were no longer the most important thing in the room. The shift had already happened, and when he spoke again, His voice carried a finality that did not need to be enforced. "The deal can be corrected," he said, pausing just long enough for the words to settle. "But perception," he added quietly, "that takes longer." And in that moment, the room understood that what had just unfolded was no longer just about a contract. It was about who had been seen, who had been ignored, and who, from this point forward, could no longer be overlooked. The room did not recover. It adjusted, slowly, carefully, like something fragile that had just been dropped but not yet broken. And every person at that table understood that the deal in front of them was no longer the same deal they had walked in to sign, not because the numbers had changed, but because the foundation beneath those numbers had shifted. Jonathan remained still for a moment longer, then straightened fully, reclaiming his posture with deliberate precision, the kind of movement that signaled control even when control had already been challenged. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, not louder, not sharper, but grounded in something closer to awareness. "We will revise the model," he said, looking directly at the investors now, not past them, not over them, but at them, because he understood that trust, once questioned, has to be rebuilt in real time. The chief financial officer nodded quickly, already gathering the documents, flipping pages, with a renewed urgency, not rushed, but focused, as if every line now carried more consequence than before. And across the table, the investors leaned in, not retreating, but engaging more critically, asking sharper questions, demanding clearer answers, because the illusion of perfection had been replaced by the expectation of proof. Ava stepped back again, returning to the edge of the room, not dismissed, not invisible, but repositioned, her presence no longer defined by her role, but by what she had revealed. And though she held no seat at the table, the space she occupied carried a quiet authority that could not be reassigned. The man who had entered last watched the exchange without interruption, his gaze moving between Jonathan and the investors, observing not just what was being said, but how it was being said, measuring the shift in tone, the recalibration of control. And after a moment, he spoke again, not to direct, but to conclude what had already begun. "Proceed," he said simply, and the single word carried permission, expectation, and judgment all at once. Jonathan gave a small nod, acknowledging not just the instruction, but the presence behind it, and as the discussion resumed, it did so differently, more deliberate, more transparent, each number clarified, each assumption questioned, because the room had learned something it could not unlearn, that certainty without verification is not strength, it is risk. Minutes passed, then more, the conversation tightening, refining, correcting, until the contract in front of them was no longer the same document it had been earlier that night. It was sharper now, cleaner, more precise, and when Jonathan finally placed his hand on it again, it was not to claim it, but to present it. "This is the corrected structure," he said, his tone steady, not performative, not dominant, just clear. One of the lead investors reviewed the final page, then looked up, his expression measured, thoughtful, and after a brief pause, he nodded once. "This works," he said, and the words carried agreement, but also something else, acknowledgement, not just of the correction, but of how it had come to be. The deal moved forward then, signatures placed, decisions finalized, the kind of conclusion that would have seemed inevitable at the start of the night, but now carried a different meaning, because everyone in that room knew that it had not been inevitable at all. It had been interrupted, redirected, and ultimately reshaped by someone they had not even considered when they first sat down. And as the final documents were gathered, as chairs shifted and quiet conversations resumed, Jonathan's gaze moved once more across the room, not to the investors, not to his team, but to Ava, standing near the edge, composed as ever. And though he did not speak, though no words were exchanged, there was something in that look that had not been there before, not ownership, not dismissal, but recognition, the kind that comes too late to change what has already happened, but just in time to understand it. The signatures were done, the numbers were settled, and one by one, the people who had entered the room with certainty began to leave with something quieter, something heavier, the kind of understanding that does not show on paper but lingers long after the deal is closed. Chairs slid back softly, quiet handshakes were exchanged, Measured smiles returned, but none of it felt exactly the same, because the night had not gone the way anyone expected, and somewhere beneath the polished surface of success, something deeper had been rewritten. Jonathan remained at the table a moment longer after the others began to disperse, his hand resting lightly on the final document, not gripping it, not claiming it, just acknowledging it, as if he understood now that the outcome he had secured was not entirely his own. Across the room, Ava moved as she had before, collecting empty glasses, straightening the table, returning the space to its original order, her movements calm, precise, unaffected by everything that had just unfolded, because for her, nothing about this moment required validation. She had not stepped forward to be seen. She had simply refused to ignore what she already knew. The man who had entered last stood near the window now, looking out over the city lights stretching far below, a skyline built on ambition, risk, and decisions like the one that had just been made. And after a moment, he turned, his gaze finding Ava once more, not calling her, not summoning attention, just waiting. Ava finished placing the last glass on the tray, then walked toward him without hesitation, not as a waitress responding to a guest, but as someone stepping into a conversation that had always belonged to her. Jonathan watched from across the room, silent, his expression unreadable, because there are moments when words no longer serve a purpose, when observation becomes the only honest response. "You handled that well," the man said quietly, his voice carrying neither surprise nor praise, only acknowledgement, and Ava gave a small nod. Her answer simple, grounded. "It needed to be said," she replied, and that was all. No explanation, no elaboration, because truth does not require decoration. The man studied her for a brief second, then allowed the faintest shift in his expression, something closer to approval than anything else, and as he turned slightly, preparing to leave, he added, almost as an afterthought but not quite, "It always does." And with that, he stepped away, his presence leaving the room as quietly as it had entered, but not without impact. Ava stood there for a moment, not watching him go, not reflecting on what had happened, simply present, as she had been from the beginning, and then she turned, lifting the tray once more, resuming her role without hesitation, because roles, unlike identity, are temporary. Jonathan finally rose from his seat, adjusting his jacket with the same precision he had carried all night. But when he looked toward Ava this time, there was no command in his gaze, no expectation, only something quieter, something closer to understanding, as if he had just learned a lesson that could not be taught in any boardroom. Ava did not look back, not because she avoided him, but because she did not need to, and as she walked toward the service door, disappearing into the part of the room where no one important was supposed to be, the truth of the night settled in its final form, clear, unshaken, and impossible to ignore. That power may control the room, but dignity is what changes it.